on the barren edge of the Dead Sea, where the earth looks wounded and the wind tastes of minerals and judgment. Tradition speaks of a figure still standing in silence. Not a queen, not a prophet, not a woman whose name the world bothered to preserve, just a witness turned into a warning. A body claimed by salt. A soul frozen in the act of choosing the past over obedience. She turned her face toward a doomed city, and that turn has never stopped speaking. For 4,000 years, her story has stood like a verdict over every generation that mistook abundance for blessing, luxury for safety, and success for the favor of God. The city behind her was Sodom, and Sodom was not some crude little camp of obvious evil. It was refined, advanced, connected. It sat in the Jordan plain like a jeweled throne, fed by trade, wealth, and the kind of confidence that only powerful civilizations possess right before they are shattered. Its streets were alive with commerce. Its storehouses were full. Its walls were built to convince the human heart that nothing could ever bring it down. Men trusted its markets. Women trusted its beauty. Leaders trusted its systems. Families trusted its comforts. And all the while, beneath the polished surface, judgment was gathering pressure. That is how it always happens. Scripture does not present collapse as random. It presents it as revelation. God lets a culture become fully visible before he answers it. He allows the hidden disease to ripen until no one can honestly pretend not to see it. Ancient prophets understood this. They knew that when a society becomes proud in its plenty, cruel in its pleasure, and numb in its conscience, the fire has already begun, even if no flame is visible yet. Lot saw the splendor first. That was his mistake. He looked at the valley and saw opportunity, not danger. He saw fertile ground, not spiritual rot. He saw a future, a platform, an easier life. And step by step, compromise stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like wisdom. That is the seduction. No one wakes up one morning and decides to lose his soul. He just keeps moving closer to what glitters, closer to comfort, closer to the city, until one day the city is no longer around him, it is inside him. And that is why this story still burns. Because this is not only about a ruined world buried under ash and salt. This is about you. About the places you keep defending because they made you feel secure. About the systems you know are sick but still call home. About the private bargains, the polished compromises, the glittering cages. About the voice of God telling people to leave while they keep asking for one more night, one more deal, one more look back. This is not a children's lesson. This is a siren. What happened in that valley was not merely destruction. It was exposure. The sky opened. The earth answered. The false glory of a great city was stripped down to smoke, mineral, fire, and memory. So listen carefully, because this is not ancient debris. This is prophecy in ruins. This is the Bible refusing to stay in the past. And before we go any further, you need to understand this with all the seriousness your soul can carry. Some places cannot be healed. Some doors only open once, and some people are not destroyed because they ran too slowly, but because they loved the burning city too much to leave. There are hours in history when heaven goes silent, the earth holds its breath, and a human being makes a decision that will outlive empires. Not because the moment looks dramatic while it is happening, not because thunder rolls or angels appear immediately overhead, but because one choice, made in full daylight and dressed up as wisdom, becomes the first stone in a road that leads straight to ruin. This is one of those hours. This is the story of a man standing between promise and appetite, between the altar and the marketplace, between the slow safety of obedience and the shining seduction of visible success. It is the story of a valley that looked like paradise, of a civilization that mistook power for permanence, and of a family that learned too late that what glitters in the sight of man may already be marked for judgment in the sight of God. Picture the land of Canaan before memory hardened into legend. The hills rise, dry and stern beneath a white sky. Wind, moves over stone. Grass survives in patches. Water is never taken for granted. Life in those elevations is hard, disciplined, uncluttered. A man learns restraint there. A man learns dependence there. That is where Abraham stood, aged by years, tempered by pilgrimage, no longer intoxicated by what could be seen. Beside him stood Lot, younger, sharp-eyed, restless in the way ambitious men are restless when they believe the future is waiting for them somewhere else. Below them opened the Jordan Plain. It was not the scarred basin modern travelers imagine. It was a living corridor of abundance. Green spread across the valley floor like a secret too rich for the surrounding wilderness. Water flashed under the sun. Groves thickened the air with sweetness. Reeds bent in the breeze. Orchards fed by springs and seasonal overflow reached toward the horizon. It was the kind of landscape that made a man feel he was looking at favor itself, like God had laid prosperity out in the open and invited someone bold enough to take it. And in the far distance, set inside that richness, were the cities. Not one settlement, not one lonely outpost, but a chain of urban power. 5 crowns laid across the plain. Their walls caught the light. Their towers announced security. Their gates promised order, commerce, influence. From the ridge, they did not look corrupt. They looked impressive. They looked stable. They looked like the future. That is always how temptation introduces itself. It rarely arrives wearing the face of obvious evil. It comes dressed as opportunity. It speaks the language of stewardship. It flatters your intelligence. It tells you that you are not compromising, only maturing, not drifting, only expanding, not weakening, only learning how the real world works. And Lot, standing beside a man who had already learned the cost of reaching too quickly for what shines, lifted his eyes and let that whisper into his heart. Abraham gave him first choice. That alone should have been enough to reveal the test. An older man, already trained by disappointment and faith, refused to grasp. He opened his hand. He let the younger man choose. He did not scramble. He did not manipulate. He did not panic at the thought of receiving less. There is a deep kind of authority in a man who does not need to seize. Abraham had it. Lot did not. Lot looked down and began to reason. He saw water that did not fail in dry seasons. He saw land that could sustain flocks, wealth, children, expansion. He saw trade routes. He saw infrastructure. He saw walled cities instead of wandering tents. He saw the difference between surviving and arriving. And somewhere inside him, perhaps so quietly that he did not even recognize it as a betrayal, a conclusion began to form. Maybe abundance itself was proof of divine approval. Maybe visible increase meant he was choosing wisely. Maybe the greener land was the godlier land. That is where many souls are lost. Not in open rebellion, in misreading blessing, in assuming that what is fruitful to the eye must be safe for the spirit, in confusing material ease with moral permission, in taking prosperity as a verdict when it may only be a test. So, Lot chose the plain. But understand this clearly. Destruction did not begin the day fire fell. It began the day he started moving in that direction. The fatal part of the story is not only where he ended up, it is how gradually he got there. First the gaze, then the preference, then the migration, then the nearness, then the settlement, then the belonging. Sin loves process. Corruption prefers patience. The enemy does not need your soul in one dramatic moment if he can have your loyalties one small concession at a time. Lot did not rush into the heart of the city on the first day. He edged toward it. He placed himself within reach of its gravity. He let its economy speak louder than its reputation. He measured gain more carefully than danger. And that is how entire lives are rearranged. Not by one monstrous leap, but by a series of sensible steps taken in the wrong direction. The wealth of that region was not only in its fields, though the fields were rich. The true engine of its power rose from the wounded earth itself. Around the basin, thick black pitch surfaced from the ground in foul-smelling pools. bubbling out of the land as if the deep places were leaking. Acrid, oily, sulfur-laced, ugly to the senses, priceless to the world. This substance, sealed ships, strengthened walls, bound masonry, preserved the dead, enabled industry. Kingdoms needed it. Builders sought it. Traders moved it like treasure. The plain did not merely grow crops. It controlled a resource that civilizations depended on. So caravans came. From the east, from the coastlands, from distant highlands and old river kingdoms, merchants traveled toward these cities because commerce follows necessity, and necessity had made the valley rich. Silver changed hands there. Exotic goods moved there. Contracts were made there. Technology, power, luxury, influence, all of it concentrated there. The region had become the Bronze Age version of a strategic engine room, an ancient center of innovation and supply, the kind of place people admired because it seemed to hold the future in its grip. And Lot walked through it. He inhaled perfume layered over industrial odor. He heard metal weighed, bargains struck, languages braided together in the streets. He saw craftsmanship that made pastoral life look crude by comparison. Fine work, fine fabric, fine architecture, fine living. There is a narcotic quality to sophistication when you have spent enough years in rough places. It makes compromise feel educated. It makes simplicity feel embarrassing. It makes holiness feel unsophisticated. But beneath all that brilliance, the ground was uneasy. Not metaphorically. Literally. The basin lay along a great fracture in the earth, one long scar running through nations and centuries. Pressure gathered below the surface. The land was never as stable as the cities pretended. The beautiful plain was resting over tension. Beneath the markets, beneath the estates, beneath the walls and trade halls and banquet rooms, creation itself was storing a warning. And warnings are easy to ignore when profit is flowing. That is the terror of prosperous cultures. The music is loud enough to drown out the tremor. The feast is rich enough to make discernment feel unnecessary. People stop reading the signs because the numbers still look good. The towers are still standing. The parties are still full. The system is still rewarding those who know how to serve it. So they call the age secure, even while the foundations groan. And I need you to hear this the way it must be heard. Lot was not choosing land alone. He was choosing atmosphere. He was choosing whose values would educate his household. He was choosing what kind of city would shape his daughters, what kind of language would retrain his conscience, what kind of success would slowly rename his compromises as normal life. That is why this story still reaches through the centuries and puts its hand on the throat of every generation. Because the question has never changed. What are you moving toward? What have you called wisdom simply because it pays well? What have you called favor simply because it is flourishing? What tremor beneath your feet have you trained yourself not to feel? The valley looked alive. The markets looked unstoppable. The future looked bright. But heaven had already seen what the eye could not. And the earth, deep below that green and glittering plain, was already preparing its answer. Who reads the warning signs when the numbers are strong, the trade routes are full, and the city is making everybody rich? That is the first lie prosperity tells. It does not merely feed the body. It anesthetizes discernment. It teaches people to laugh at tremors because the banquet is still warm. It teaches rulers to mock prophets because the treasury is still full. It teaches ordinary men to call danger, noise, and judgment, superstition, and spiritual decay the cost of progress. When a civilization is cashing in, almost nobody wants to hear that the foundation is cracking underneath their feet. Lot stopped being a man of the open country. That is where the real change happened. Not in one public scandal, not in one dramatic renunciation of faith, not in one moment where he announced, with full awareness, that he had traded God for comfort. The transformation was slower, quieter, more respectable than that. First, he lived near the city. Then he learned its rhythms. Then he accepted its conveniences. Then he built within its shadow. Then, at last, He ceased to dwell as a traveler and began to dwell as a stakeholder. A tent can be folded by morning. A tent remembers that the world is temporary. A tent belongs to a pilgrim, to a man who knows he is passing through, to a soul that has not yet mistaken survival for citizenship. But a permanent house behind secured walls says something else. It says, I have arrived. I am established. My roots are here. My future is tied to this place. Do not miss the weight of that shift. Lot did not merely improve his standard of living, he rewrote his identity. And the ancient ruins bear witness to what kind of world he entered. Near the Dead Sea region, archaeology has uncovered the remains of great fortified settlements from the Bronze Age. Heavy ramparts, complex gate systems, public architecture, defensive works on a scale that only organized wealth could produce. These were not fragile camps in the wilderness. These were power centers, built to intimidate, built to endure, built to make human beings feel safer than they really were. Stone everywhere, strength everywhere, the illusion of permanence everywhere. That is what seduced him. At night, the city breathed through his windows. Music drifted through the streets. Cups struck tables. Laughter rolled long after dark. Processions moved under torchlight. Deals continued after sundown. Desire had an economy there. Appetite had a calendar. Celebration had no Sabbath. The city knew how to keep itself awake. At first, it grated against him. At first, his spirit still recoiled. At first, he could still feel the abrasion between what he had inherited from Abraham and what he was now permitting around himself. But human beings are terrifyingly adaptable. That is one of the darkest truths in all of Scripture and all of history. The soul can get used to almost anything. Noise becomes atmosphere. Filth becomes background. Outrage becomes routine. A man can begin by grieving over the corruption around him and end by structuring his life so he no longer has to feel that grief too sharply. That is how compromise matures. Not by persuading you that evil is lovely, by persuading you that evil is normal, by persuading you that your discomfort is immature, your convictions are impractical, your moral clarity is unsophisticated. And once that happens, the categories start to blur. You no longer know the difference between refinement and rot, between luxury and decadence, between social order and spiritual collapse. What should trouble you begins to impress you. What should repel you begins to entertain you. What should drive you to prayer becomes the very environment in which you build your future. The city called itself advanced. Lot called it civilization. Then came the final corruption. Influence. He was no longer merely living there. He was recognized there. He was seated where men of consequence sat. A place near the gate where law, trade, power, and reputation braided together. Understand what that means. He had crossed from outsider to participant, from observer to functionary, from man troubled by the system to man useful to the system. And power always demands silence as its entrance fee. The more a man benefits from a structure, the harder it becomes for him to speak honestly about what sustains it. That is as true now as it was then. Careers depend on this silence. Cities depend on this silence. Institutions depend on this silence. Entire classes of respectable people survive by learning which truths may be privately felt but never publicly spoken. Lot had once walked in the spiritual atmosphere of Abraham, where altars were built under the open sky, and the name of God was not embarrassing. Now he sat where polished men managed polished corruption with polished language. The valley itself was a federation of profitable cities, each feeding the others, each strengthening the illusion that the whole order was too useful to fall. Goods moved. Herds moved. Textiles moved. Wealth circulated. Travelers passed through. Sodom stood at the center, like the jeweled heart of a glittering body. It was efficient, connected, impressive. Every road led toward gain. Walk through it in your mind. Hear the bargaining rise and fall in layered accents. Smell spice, roasted meat, wine, sweat, oil, incense, and the chemical tang of earth-born pitch clinging faintly to everything. See bronze flashing in the sun. See dyed cloth hanging in folds of red and saffron and blue. See carved images of foreign gods displayed like tasteful decoration. See elegance everywhere. But then, look lower. Look harder. Watch who walks with ease and who walks with fear. Because every rich system reveals itself by what it does to the vulnerable. The native-born moved with confidence. The wealthy moved with entitlement. The connected moved with a kind of unspoken immunity. But the outsider moved carefully. The poor kept their heads down. The traveler entered the public square already marked. In cities like this, hospitality had died and spectacle had replaced it. The foreigner was not protected. He was tested, mocked, squeezed, exposed. The powerless existed for the amusement and extraction of the powerful. This is why the prophets later spoke of Sodom in terms larger than one sin: pride, excess, indifference, full stomachs and empty mercy, leisure with no conscience, abundance without holiness, a people so insulated by their own pleasure that they turned humiliation into entertainment and exploitation into social custom. And Lot saw all of it. He saw the stranger being handled roughly in the street while officials pretended not to notice. He saw theft dismissed as cleverness. He saw cruelty explained away as civic realism. He saw the weak become invisible. He saw the moral bloodstream of the city thicken and darken. And day after day, he stayed in his seat. Abraham built altars in empty places. Sodom built ritual chambers in crowded places. That contrast matters. One world met God in simplicity. The other hid its spiritual life behind ornament, power, and blood. In the hills, a man cried out beneath the sky. In the plain, religion had become theater, appetite, transaction. Fear was perfumed. Violence was sacralized. Desire was liturgized. The gods of the cities did not ask people to repent. They asked them to participate, to join in, to celebrate what heaven abhorred and call it enlightened. And because families are always evangelized by their environment, Lot's household began to absorb the city. His daughters dressed like the place that shaped them. His wife moved through its social rituals with increasing ease. Customs became harmless. Symbols became fashionable. Banquets became networking. Spiritual compromise changed its name and called itself culture. That is how households are lost. Rarely by one open renunciation. Usually by atmosphere, by repetition, by embarrassment, by the slow shrinking of the Father's voice until it can no longer compete with comfort. Then creation itself began to preach. The air changed first. Heat arrived out of season, heavy and metallic, as though the valley had been sealed beneath an invisible lid. Water lines shifted. Salt gathered where it should not have gathered. Animals became uneasy. Old men in rough country watched the horizon and muttered that the land felt wrong. The stars seemed harsher at night. The light at evening carried a tension no wall could keep out. But the elite laughed, because elites almost always laugh before they panic. Warnings sound foolish to those who have built identities around control. Civilized men do not fear omens, they say. Sophisticated women do not trouble themselves with prophetic language. Successful people trust systems, not signs. They trust engineering, policy, trade, security, scale. They believe that whatever threatens other people can be managed here. And yet one evening, standing above the city he had chosen, Lot felt it, a cold disturbance, a tightening in the chest, that ancient sensation the soul experiences when truth breaks through sedation for one unbearable moment. The skyline looked normal, but not normal. The light lay across the valley beautifully, but the beauty had become menacing. Somewhere deep within him, beneath years of adaptation, something still remembered God. But memory is not the same as obedience. So he went back inside, sat down at the table. continued the routine. Because that is what frightened men do when surrounded by a culture too large to resist. They tell themselves that real catastrophe would come with public warning. They assume somebody higher, stronger, wiser, more official would announce it if doom were truly near. And while the city kept eating, laughing, trading, and dismissing the signs, heaven had already set its answer in motion. Far off, beyond Lot's sight, figures were moving toward Abraham's dwelling. Step by step, quietly, deliberately, judgment had left the horizon and entered history. By the oaks of Mamre, the world seemed to pause. Those trees were old when Abraham was old. Their roots had drunk from the same earth for generations. Their trunks rose dark and immense from the ground like pillars left behind by an older creation, and their branches spread so wide they turned sunlight into something filtered, priestly, almost judicial. Beneath them, the afternoon had entered that merciless hour when heat is no longer weather but pressure. The wind withdrew. Birds disappeared into silence. Even the insects seemed to understand that something holy and terrible was moving just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, a man worn by years, sharpened by obedience, thinned by waiting. Age had bent parts of him, but not the part that listens. His beard had gone white. His body no longer moved like it once had, but his spirit was still alert in the way the spirit becomes alert when it has lived long enough with God to recognize disturbance in the air. Then he saw them, 3 figures, not approaching from far off, not cresting a hill, simply there, standing in the shimmer, as if the heat itself had given them form. No trumpet announced them, no blaze of glory surrounded them. Heaven often arrives that way without spectacle first. Only weight, only presence, only the deep interior knowledge that this moment is no longer ordinary and your soul had better wake up. Abraham did not interrogate them. He did not ask for credentials. He did not measure whether serving them would be convenient. He rose fast, faster than an old man should have moved in that kind of heat, and hurried toward them with the urgency of someone who understood that hospitality is not manners. It is revelation. It is judgment. It is the test, hidden inside daily life. He bowed low before them, because righteous people know that sometimes eternity comes clothed in dust. This is what separated Abraham from Sodom before a single word of judgment was spoken. A stranger came near Abraham, and he opened his world. A stranger would come near Sodom, and they would bare their teeth. Never forget that. Whole civilizations are exposed by how they treat the unprotected. Abraham called for water, for rest, for bread, then more than bread, much more. He moved with command, but not with panic. There was order in his generosity. His household stirred like a camp preparing for sacred business. Fine flour was brought out. Meat was prepared. Butter, milk, the richest portions, not the scraps. He did not offer what was easiest. He offered what was worthy. That is what reverence does. It costs something. It reaches for the best. It does not calculate first and honor later. And Sarah, old Sarah, weary Sarah, Sarah who had learned how to bury disappointment under routine, worked with her own hands to prepare the meal. Do you see the contrast? Out on the plain, wealth had taught people to exploit the vulnerable. Here, in the high country, covenant taught people to serve them. Out there, strangers were leverage. Here, strangers were sacred. Out there, abundance had become cruelty. Here, scarcity had become worship. The moral difference between the tent and the city was already total before the fire ever fell. So Abraham stood by while they ate, not as lord of the household, but as servant. That detail matters. Because when heaven visits, rank collapses. Pride has no vocabulary for holy presence. Only humility can remain standing in it. Then the conversation turned. They asked for Sarah, not because they lacked information, because revelation always moves toward the wound. God does not circle our pain politely. He puts his finger on the very place we trained ourselves not to hope anymore. And then came the word that split open the silence. Sarah would bear a son. Not someday in a vague, symbolic sense, not as a poetic metaphor. A real son, in time, in flesh, in the body of a woman long past the age where women plan for children. Inside the tent, Sarah heard it and laughed. Not a bright laugh, not the laughter of delight. This was the brittle sound people make when promise collides with long disappointment. It was the laugh of exhausted realism, the laugh of someone who had suffered enough to distrust joy before it arrives. Years had taught her how to survive without expectation, and now heaven was speaking directly into the graveyard of her natural possibility. The voice answered her hidden laugh. That is when the air changed, not because the words were loud, because they were sovereign. The one speaking was not offering optimism. He was issuing reality. He knew what she had said when no human ear had heard it. He knew the fracture between outward composure and inward cynicism. He knew the lie fear tells the mouth. She denied laughing, because human beings always flinch when God uncovers what they thought was secret. But heaven does not argue with us about what it already knows. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted from promise to indictment. This is one of the most frightening transitions in all of Scripture. Life and judgment standing in the same conversation. Mercy at the table, wrath already on the road. The same visitation that spoke a future into Sarah's barrenness now turned toward the plain where Lot was living among his prophets and compromises. The God who opens dead wombs is also the God who answers moral rot. The sentimental heart hates this truth, but the prophetic mind understands it immediately. Divine love is not softness. Divine mercy is not indifference. And divine patience does not mean divine blindness. The outcry had risen, not gossip, not rumor. Outcry, that word carries blood in it. It carries violation. It carries the accumulated cry of the humiliated, the devoured, the mocked, the abused, the stranger crushed by a city too rich to care. Sodom had become loud in heaven long before heaven became loud on earth. And now Abraham understood where these visitors were headed, toward the valley, toward the cities, toward Lot, toward the house where his nephew's wife and daughters slept, still trusting in walls, still sheltered by a world already marked for destruction. Abraham knew enough of God to understand what was happening, and still loved enough of man to try to intervene. So he stepped into one of the most astonishing moments in sacred history. He began to intercede, not with arrogance, not with accusation, not with theological performance. He stood before the judge of all the earth and pleaded for mercy on behalf of a city that did not deserve it. This is what true righteousness does. It does not become smug in the presence of judgment. It trembles and asks whether mercy can still be found. What if there were 50? Then fewer. Then fewer still. The numbers fell like hammer blows. Each request stripped away another layer of hope. Abraham was not bargaining like a merchant. He was descending into horror, one number at a time. Because every reduction forced the question deeper. How much living conscience is actually left in that city? How many souls remain who would still protect the vulnerable, resist the crowd, refuse the logic of corruption, stand in the gap when the whole social order rewards evil? The answer from heaven remained steady. If that many righteous were found, the place would be spared. Do not rush past that. God was willing to preserve an entire city for the sake of a remnant inside it. That is how powerful righteousness still is, even in a corrupt age. A few people with living conscience can restrain catastrophe longer than nations know. A handful of holy people can hold back ruin for millions. Never believe your integrity is socially irrelevant. Heaven does not measure as the world measures. But Abraham kept going downward, because he knew what kind of valley lay below. 45, 40, 30, 20, then finally, 10. By the time he reached that number, the request itself had become a confession. He was no longer hoping in the city. He was hoping against it. 10 people, not 10 flawless souls, just 10 who were not fully swallowed. 10 who still blushed at evil, 10 who would not join the mob, 10 who still possessed the sacred instinct to shelter the stranger instead of feeding on him. And somewhere beneath every word was dread, because Abraham suspected even 10 might be too high. That is the point where intercession becomes agony, when you are not praying from confidence, but from the terrible suspicion that the rot has gone deeper than anyone wants to say aloud. When you know a culture may already be standing at the edge of an answer it has spent years inviting. Then the exchange ended. The presence withdrew. 2 messengers turned toward the valley in the appearance of ordinary men, and Abraham remained where he was, watching them descend toward history. That is one of the loneliest images in the Bible. A man of God, standing under ancient trees, having prayed as far as prayer could go. He had done all he could do, and sometimes that is the heaviest grief of all, because there are moments when even the faithful cannot stop what a civilization has chosen. They can plead, they can warn, they can stand in the breach, but if a people have hardened themselves completely, eventually the answer comes, and when it comes, it does not come suddenly. It comes after the outcry, after the warnings, after the patience, after the plea. It comes when mercy has been offered every way mercy can be offered, and the city still prefers itself. The descent into Sodom was not long, but it was enough. Enough for the land to change its face, enough for the air to lose its innocence, enough for heaven to let the world feel, in its nerves and in its lungs, that something irreversible had begun. From the uplands down into the basin, the road bent through stone, dust, and heat, dropping steadily toward that low and haunted plain where wealth had ripened into arrogance. 2 travelers moved along it without spectacle. No halos, no banners, no visible flame. Just men, by all outward appearance, sun-darkened skin, road-stained garments, sandals powdered with the earth of long distances. Nothing about them announced judgment. Nothing about them warned the eye. And that was the mercy of the test. Because cities are not only judged by what they profess, they are judged by what they do when the vulnerable arrive unprotected. As those 2 figures moved lower into the valley, creation itself seemed to recoil. The songs in the air thinned out first, then vanished. Wings went quiet. The insects that had filled the afternoon with their endless hidden machinery fell still. The wind, which had crossed the ridges all day with steady breath, suddenly withdrew as though the atmosphere had shut a door. What remained was pressure. Not heat alone. Pressure. A thickness in the air that living things understood before human language could explain it. Shepherds, on the higher slopes, tightened their grip on their staffs and drew their animals inward. Men on the trade road, hardened men who could not have named what troubled them, felt it anyway and quickened their steps. The body often knows before the mind agrees. By the time the strangers neared the city, dusk had begun to gather at the edges of the plain. Sodom rose before them in the last declining light, fortified, self-assured, rich with the kind of confidence that only powerful societies possess when they have mistaken endurance for innocence. The gate stood open. Stone everywhere. Human strength arranged into architecture so that men could stand inside it and imagine themselves untouchable. Lot was seated there, not wandering outside the city as a troubled outsider, not lingering at a distance in unresolved discomfort. Seated, established, recognized. He had a place now among men whose names mattered. In the ancient world, the gate was more than an entrance. It was where transactions were witnessed, verdicts were issued, influence was seen in public. To sit there was to belong to the civic bloodstream. It meant status. It meant relevance. It meant the city had accepted you, and you had accepted the city in return. That was where they found him. And the moment he saw them, something long buried, convulsed awake inside him. It was not full repentance. Not yet. Not courage in its pure form. But it was recognition. A violent, inner recognition. The kind that cuts through years of compromise in a single instant and reminds a man that however deeply he has adjusted to darkness, some part of him still remembers the difference between holy and unclean. He did not know everything about them, but he knew enough. enough to understand that they could not, under any circumstance, be left exposed in that square after nightfall. So he rose. That detail matters, because there are moments when even compromised souls feel the last flicker of their original training. Abraham had taught him something once. Not enough to keep him clean, not enough to keep him out of Sodom, but enough that when holiness appeared disguised as need, he still knew he had to move. He hurried to them, bowed low, urged them to turn aside. "Come, under my roof, wash, rest, eat. Leave early if you must, but do not remain outside." At first they refused. That refusal was part of the unveiling. They spoke as ordinary travelers might speak, willing to stay in public space, content to spend the night in the open. But Lot pressed harder. Not politely, urgently, almost with panic. He gave no full explanation because none was needed. Fear was already breaking through his voice. The strangers heard it. They let him insist. And so they turned toward his house, while the city watched. That walk home must have felt longer than the entire descent from the hills, because now Lot could feel eyes following him. He knew the psychology of the place too well. He knew how curiosity thickened into appetite, how gossip turned predatory by night, how a civilized city, elegant in daylight, revealed its true liturgy after dark. He moved fast, nearly dragging the evening behind him, and brought them inside. Then he set a meal before them, bread made quickly, a table prepared in haste, hospitality under pressure. It carried the rhythm of emergency, as though the house itself understood that this meal belonged to the thin space between mercy and catastrophe. His wife objected almost immediately. There were obligations, invitations, important people expecting them elsewhere, social rules, public image, reputation. This is how compromise speaks when it has become domestic. Not as outright evil, but as embarrassment at righteousness. Don't be extreme. Don't make this awkward. Don't disrupt the order of things for strangers. But for once, Lot did not bend. These men would remain. These men would eat. These men, whatever else happened, would not be handed over easily. Outside, evening completed its transformation. Markets shut their mouths. Torches came alive one by one. Wine began to move. Doors opened. Streets filled with that strange human energy that rises when day's restraints loosen and appetite takes the wheel. Somewhere between sunset and full dark, a whisper began to move through the city. There were outsiders at Lot's house. Foreign men. Unclaimed. Exposed. And over all of it, the city was gorgeous. That is part of the horror. The western light poured across the limestone and turned the entire urban mass into brilliance. Gold, amber, copper, red. For a brief stretch of evening, Sodom did not look cursed. It looked blessed. It looked like a masterpiece of human flourishing. It looked like the sort of place people fight to enter and refuse to leave. The beauty was real. The lie was deeper. Some places shine brightest when they are closest to exposure. Lot stood in that beauty and felt the weight of memory. He remembered what he had seen when he first looked toward this plain. Promise, security, increase, a future with shape and substance. Toward a life less fragile than tents in open country. And step by step, he had been absorbed. That is what struck him now, not merely that he lived in Sodom, but that Sodom had learned his voice, clothed his family, fed his pride, structured his days, and hollowed out parts of him so quietly he barely knew what had gone missing. It felt like grief, but not clean grief, more like the ache of a self half lost. And above the beauty, there was something wrong with the sky. Not wrong enough for the complacent to notice. Wrong enough for the spiritually injured to feel. Beneath the bands of firelit evening lay a bruised depth of color, a darkening stain in the heavens, as though the day had suffered an invisible wound. The light was too beautiful and too ominous at once. It carried splendor with a threat inside it. Creation was signaling, in the language of atmosphere, what Scripture signals in the language of prophecy. When a society reaches a certain point, even beauty begins to testify against it. Then the sound began. First, a disturbance in the street. Then, layered voices. Then, movement with direction. Then, the unmistakable rhythm of many people deciding to become one thing together. Crowds do that. They surrender individual conscience to shared desire and call the transformation strength. What had begun as rumor now gathered mass, feet on stone, laughter with edge in it, the low, feverish chatter of people approaching an act they know is evil, but have rehearsed so often in their own minds that it now feels justified. Lot heard it from inside the house. He heard the convergence, the tightening circle, the city coming to claim what the city believed was owed to it. Then the pounding hit the door. Not hesitation, not inquiry, impact. Wood shuddered under fists, staffs, demand. It was the sound of appetite arriving with legal confidence, the sound of a mob already certain of its own righteousness. Lot turned and looked at the men seated within his house. They were composed, still, watching, not afraid. And in that instant he understood the true terror of the hour. This was never about whether they would survive the city. This was about whether the city would survive its own exposure. His wife caught his arm and whispered the language of every compromised age. Don't escalate. Don't make this costly. Give the crowd what it wants. Protect the household. Protect the peace. Protect your standing. That is the creed of dying civilizations. Sacrifice truth, but preserve comfort. Betray innocence, but keep the machine running. Lot pulled away, because even wrecked men sometimes arrive at a final line. His hands trembled. His pulse thundered, but he went to the door anyway, opened it, stepped outside, and closed it behind him. Alone between his guests and his neighbors, alone between the remains of conscience and the full face of the city. And Sodom looked back at him, hungry and smiling, as if it had been waiting all along for this exact moment, for the night when a man who once belonged to God would be forced to discover what kind of city he had really chosen. The street was no longer a street. It had become a mouth. They came from every quarter of the city, not only the reckless young men who loved disorder, not only drunkards and predators from the margins, but the respectable ones too. The established ones, the men who spoke of law by daylight and honor at their own tables by night, traders, craftsmen, laborers, elders, men who had kissed their children before sundown and now stood shoulder to shoulder beneath torchlight, with lust and violence burning openly across their faces. That is the horror Scripture forces us to face. Not merely that Sodom was corrupt, but that its corruption had become communal. Evil had gone public. Appetite had become civic ritual. The mob was not an interruption of the city's values. It was the city revealing them. Their voices rose together and struck the house like thrown stones. Where are the men you brought inside? The demand was not confused, not curious, not ambiguous. They were not asking for conversation. They were demanding possession. In that moment, hospitality itself was on trial. The right of the stranger to exist without being devoured was on trial. The final dignity of human beings made in the image of God was on trial. And Lot, standing in the doorway of the life he had built, felt everything collapse inward at once. Because now, he could see it. Not the version of the city he had marketed to himself for years. Not the polished version. Not the one dressed in commerce, architecture, influence, and opportunity. The real one. The one that had been there all along. The one he had learned to excuse. The one he had sat beside, profited from, voted with, dined among, and called civilization. Standing before that crowd, Lot felt the crushing knowledge that he had not merely lived in a sick place. He had become entangled with it so deeply that its shame had entered his own house. He lifted his hands and tried to reason with them. He even called them brothers. That word is one of the saddest sounds in the entire story, because it tells you how badly he still wanted to believe there was something left in them to appeal to. Some ember of moral memory, some remnant of restraint, some human line they would not cross. But there are moments when a society has moved so far into appetite that the old language no longer lands. Brotherhood means nothing to men who have made hunger their god. Then Lot did the unthinkable. Out of panic, out of distortion, out of the moral ruin that compromise works inside a man over time, he spoke words that should never be spoken by a father. He offered his daughters to the crowd in place of his guests. Do not sanitize that moment. Do not rush past it because Lot is called righteous elsewhere. He was righteous the way men sometimes are righteous after surviving a filthy age by inches and wounds and contradictions. But here, in this doorway, you see the truth about compromise. Even when a man finally tries to do one brave thing, the rot he has tolerated for years has already damaged the instincts by which courage should operate. He was trying to protect the innocent, and in the same breath, he betrayed the innocent closest to him. Inside the house, his daughters heard him, and something invisible shattered. Not wood, not stone, something worse. Trust, shelter, the sacred architecture of fatherhood, the deep, unspoken certainty that home is the place where someone stands between you and the wolves. Once that breaks, it does not mend cleanly. Some words remain in a room long after the speaker is gone, but the crowd rejected even that, not because they were morally offended, not because they possessed standards. They rejected it because their rage had turned personal. Their fury rose now not only against the strangers, but against Lot himself. Who did he think he was? A foreigner who had made money among them, an outsider who had risen in their system, a man welcomed into their councils, now daring to restrain the very city that had given him standing. In their eyes, his appeal to righteousness was treason. They surged forward. The whole mass of them heaved as one body, and Lot felt himself driven backward by hot breath, smoke, sweat, wine, and the animal smell of men who had surrendered conscience to collective desire. He could feel death on him then, not abstract death, not the distant theological idea of judgment, immediate death, the kind delivered by neighbors, convinced they are protecting the order of the city while they destroy the last evidence that justice ever lived there. Then the house opened behind him. Hands seized him with terrifying strength and pulled him back across the threshold. The door slammed shut, and suddenly, the darkness outside was pierced by a light that did not belong to fire, oil, moon, or sun. It did not dance like torchlight. It did not flicker like flame. It struck, white, clean, absolute, a kind of radiance that did not merely illuminate but exposed. It hit the crowd with the violence of revelation. They cried out and recoiled, their bodies twisting, hands flying to their faces. The same men who had moments earlier advanced with confidence now stumbled over one another in blind agony, shrieking under a brightness their eyes could not bear. This was not darkness falling over them. It was something worse. It was sight taken away by light. Their eyes remained open, but vision had abandoned them. The pain was immediate, scorching, disorienting, like the body had been forced to look directly into a brilliance it was never built to endure. But here is what makes the moment apocalyptic. Even broken by pain, they did not repent. Even blinded, they did not retreat. They kept reaching for the door. That is the true diagnosis of spiritual corruption. Not simply that people do evil, but that after evil burns them, humiliates them, wounds them, strips them of dignity, they still crawl toward it, still grope for it, still demand access to it. A mob has no soul of its own. It has appetite only, and appetite, once enthroned, does not stop because it has become irrational. It becomes irrational because it has enthroned itself. Inside, Lot collapsed against the wall, breath torn out of rhythm, body shaking. The strangers stood over him, and the final mask fell away. There was no more pretending they were merely travelers. Something in the air around them had changed. When they spoke, their voices carried a depth that no human throat should have been able to produce. Who else belongs to you in this city? The question came like a blade. Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone tied to your name, anyone attached to your house. Bring them out. Immediately, because the sentence has been issued. The cry of this city has risen too high. The time for delay is over. Destroy. That word landed in the room with the weight of a shut gate. The kind of judgment that leaves no ruins worth rebuilding, because the structure itself has become diseased to the core. So Lot ran back out into the streets. The blind still staggered and cursed. Torches burned low. Night had deepened into that terrible hour when revelry collapses into exhaustion and every sound feels haunted. He went to the homes of the men pledged to his daughters, pounded on their doors, called them to wake, called them to flee, called them to believe that the city they trusted was about to vanish beneath the weight of heaven's answer. They stared at him and laughed, not with theatrical cruelty, with something colder, the laughter of men who cannot imagine history turning against them, the laughter of the comfortable when warned, the laughter of those whose wealth has insulated them so thoroughly that judgment sounds provincial, embarrassing, outdated. They saw an agitated old man, a religious panic, an inconvenient disruption. And that may be the loneliest sound a watchman ever hears, the laughter of people already marked by what they refuse to believe. So the doors shut in his face, and Lot stood in the street under a dying night, carrying a warning no one respected, feeling the awful truth that years of compromise had stripped his voice of authority. He had stayed too long in Sodom to sound credible when he finally spoke against it. By the time he returned, dawn was not far away. The command came again, stripped of all softness. Get up, take your wife, take your daughters, leave now, or be consumed with the city. But he froze, because judgment is easiest to acknowledge in the abstract and hardest to obey when it requires abandonment. He looked around the house and saw not objects, but biography. The table where agreements had been made, the fabrics bought with success, the silver that reflected years of arrival, the ornaments, the fine details, the accumulated proof that he had not wasted his life. His wife wept, not because she doubted the danger, but because she loved the life that danger threatened to erase. This is the psychology of the cage. After enough years inside it, captivity begins to feel like identity. Escape feels like death. The open door feels violent, so mercy took the form of force. The messengers did not negotiate. They did not sit Lot down for one more reflective conversation. They seized him, seized his wife, seized the daughters. Their grip was not tender. It was necessary. The hand of heaven sometimes feels less like comfort than extraction, less like soothing than rescue under pressure. Scripture calls that mercy, and it is mercy. Not because it feels gentle, but because it refuses to leave a man inside the thing that will kill him. And this is the part modern people do not want to hear. Mercy is not always gentle. Sometimes mercy does not arrive as a whisper, a warm feeling, a soft invitation that leaves your options untouched. Sometimes mercy comes like an interruption, like seizure, like extraction, like the hand of God closing around a man who has waited too long, compromised too deeply, and lost the inner strength to save himself. There are moments when grace no longer feels like comfort. It feels like force. It feels like being torn away from what you swore you needed, because heaven has already judged the house to be unsalvageable. That is what happened to Lot. He did not walk out with noble resolve. He was not suddenly transformed into a fearless pilgrim. He hesitated. He stalled. He looked around at the life he had built and could not make his body obey the warning fast enough. So the messengers took hold of him, took hold of his wife, took hold of his daughters, and pulled them bodily through the city that was about to be erased. That grip was not cruel. It was severe compassion. It was rescue stronger than preference. It was mercy in its most terrifying form. Not permission to choose well, but refusal to let you die in the thing you still love. They dragged them through streets that still held the residue of the night's corruption, past houses where men groaned in blindness and rage, past courtyards where lamps were burning low, past sanctuaries built to false gods, where the officiants still slept under embroidered covers, unaware that their altars had only hours left to stand, past the gate where Lot had once sat in prestige, The gate he thought meant safety. The gate built from massive stone that would soon become nothing more than debris and ash and memory. Every step away from the city was a step away from the illusion. And when they reached the outer edge, where ordered streets gave way to raw earth, where the last geometry of Sodom broke against the open land, the command came down with terrible simplicity. Run for your life. No backward glance. No pause in the plain. No sentimental delay. No final review of what you are leaving. Go to the high country. Go now. Keep moving. The instruction was not symbolic. It was surgical. Heaven was not giving spiritual advice. Heaven was severing attachment. And Lot looked toward the mountains with dread. That is the detail that unmasks him. The hills stood there in the dim pre-dawn, dark and harsh against a paling sky. The same rough country where Abraham still lived without the polish of city life, without the prestige of civic office, without the insulated comforts Lot had learned to call necessary. Those hills represented more than geography. They represented surrender, simplicity, exposure, dependence. To Lot, after years of urban security and social status, they looked less like refuge and more like humiliation. He could leave destruction. He just could not imagine returning to obscurity. That is the tragedy of a soul long domesticated by comfort. It will believe escape is possible, but only on terms that preserve ego. So even there, even with judgment already breathing down the plain, even with angelic urgency ringing in his ears, Lot negotiated. That is how deep compromise runs. It bargains at the edge of the abyss. It pleads for a reduced version of disobedience. It asks not to remain in rebellion openly, only to be allowed a more manageable form of attachment. Lot did not ask to stay in Sodom. He asked for something that sounded smaller, humbler, safer, a lesser city, a nearby refuge, a modest concession. Just let me go there, he said in effect. Not to the mountains, not all the way out, not back to radical dependence. There is another place close by, smaller, less grand, less dangerous surely. Let me have that. This is one of the most devastating moments in the story because it reveals a truth about the human heart that has not changed in 4,000 years. Most people do not reject deliverance outright. They negotiate its cost. They do not say, I want to perish. They say, save me, but let me keep something. Let me keep the pattern. Let me keep the atmosphere. Let me keep the system, only in miniature. Let me leave the worst version of the city, but not the logic of the city. Let me have a smaller compromise, a cleaner compromise, a respectable compromise, a little Zoar of my own. That is what he asked for, and the answer came back with a restraint that almost hurts to read. Not because Lot deserved accommodation, but because judgment, even when final, still moves through mercy when it can. The messenger told him to run there quickly, because the sentence hanging over the valley would not fully descend until he arrived. So they ran. Lot, his wife, his daughters, 4 figures moving through the gray seam between night and dawn, stumbling over the earth with fear in their lungs and unfinished separation in their hearts. The light was not yet fully born, but the world had already changed. The air had thickened, not with ordinary humidity, not with desert heat alone, with charge, with tension. With that unbearable, metallic stillness creation sometimes wears just before it convulses. The atmosphere felt swollen, overfull, as though heaven and earth were both holding something back for one final moment. Beneath that silence there was a vibration, not quite sound, not quite motion. Something felt first in the ribs, then in the teeth, then in the soles of the feet. A subterranean warning, a low, gathering pulse. Animals heard it before human beings did. Dogs lifted their heads and began to howl toward nothing visible. Birds broke from their resting places in disordered bursts, wheeling across the dim sky without pattern. Herd animals shifted and stamped and pulled against their tethers. The entire valley seemed to sense an event approaching that no wall, no priesthood, no commerce, no military order could negotiate with. And still, in Sodom, routine continued. This is what makes judgment so frightening. It often arrives while the ovens are being lit. Behind them, the city was waking as though history had not already turned against it. Bakers prepared the first bread of the morning. Traders organized goods for the market. Servants opened doors and swept thresholds. Guards rotated at the gate. Physicians bent over the men stricken blind in the night, trying to diagnose with natural language what had been supernatural exposure. Mothers rose. Children stirred. Officials prepared for another day inside what they assumed was the most secure city in the valley. Everything looked normal. That phrase should terrify you, because whole cultures are often nearest collapse at the exact moment they feel most continuous with themselves. The machine is still functioning. The schedules are still being kept. The currency still holds. The elites still speak confidently. The ceremonies still proceed. And underneath all of that, the decree has already gone forth. Lot ran on weak legs. Years of comfort had not prepared him for flight. Status is heavy when you have to outrun the consequences of it. His breathing tore through his chest. His feet struck hard ground that felt less stable with every step. His wife struggled beside him, carrying not luggage, but something heavier. Inward attachment. His daughters followed in shock, pulled forward by terror, and by the only clear command left in the world, keep moving. And that little city ahead, that small place on the plain, seemed to Lot like reason, like moderation, like a workable salvation, like proof that one does not have to abandon everything, only the worst part. But heaven's warnings are rarely about scale. They are about allegiance. A smaller city can still belong to the same valley. A quieter compromise can still carry the same poison. A less visible bondage can still be bondage. That is why this story speaks so directly into the present hour. Because people still think they can outrun judgment without leaving the system that invited it. They still think they can preserve the habits, preserve the values, preserve the appetites, preserve the architecture of a dying world, so long as they relocate into a gentler corner of it. They still say, not Sodom, just something nearby. Just something manageable. Just something little. But dawn was already climbing. The plane was already charged. The unseen had already crossed into the scene. And Lot, gasping his way toward a reduced version of safety, had no idea that the real danger was not only behind him in the doomed city, it was still inside him, asking to be preserved. Dawn broke over the plain with a beauty so pure it felt almost offensive. The first light climbed the eastern rim of the world and poured itself across the valley in sheets of pale gold. The towers caught it. The rooftops caught it. The white stone of the cities caught it and glowed as if heaven itself had laid a blessing on the place. It was radiant, majestic, serene, the kind of morning that makes human beings believe history will continue exactly as it did yesterday. That was the last lie Sodom ever believed. Then the heavens convulsed. There is no softer word for it, no polite language, no restrained description. Something broke open above the valley, and the sky stopped behaving like sky. Those waking in the cities did not see an ordinary sunrise unfolding by degrees. They saw a sudden brilliance tear through the upper air, a white so violent, so absolute, that daylight itself seemed to recoil from it. For one terrible instant, the sun looked weak beside it. Imagine it. A mass from the deep dark beyond the earth, plunging downward at impossible speed, stone, ice, fire, unborn, until friction awakened it. As it entered the atmosphere, the violence of its descent wrapped it in a sheath of plasma, a moving furnace, a star dragged low over the earth. Science would call it an airburst, the catastrophic detonation of a celestial body in the lower sky. Scripture would call it judgment raining from above. Both, in their own language, would be telling the truth. It came down screaming, not with a sound the human ear could track cleanly, but with force preceding sound, with pressure preceding understanding, with terror arriving before thought. Then, above the plain, the thing ruptured. The internal strain became too great. The object did not strike the ground intact. It exploded in the air with the energy of a weapon beyond Bronze Age imagination, beyond empire, beyond war, beyond anything the people below had ever named. The flash hit first. That is always how it is with judgment. First exposure, then impact. The baker reaching toward the oven never finished the motion. The merchant lifting a shop curtain never saw it fully rise. A mother bending over her child did not have time to turn her head. Light struck the city faster than fear could form. It passed through eyelids. It burned through shadow. It touched skin and turned it from living tissue into ruin in less time than it takes for the mind to register pain. The air itself became radiant death. Then came the heat. Not ordinary heat. Not the heat of desert noon. Not the heat of kiln or forge or battlefield fire. Timber vanished. Flesh did not merely burn. In the center of it, flesh ceased to exist in any familiar way. Bodies became outline, residue, interruption, human strength, civic order, architecture, wealth, hierarchy. Everything the cities had trusted met a temperature against which status was meaningless, and they had no time. That is the terror. No time to debate, no time to prepare, no time to call for priests, guards, magistrates, healers, or gods. No time to gather children, no time to repent eloquently. One instant, the city existed in confidence. The next, it was being translated into ash, vapor, splintered stone, and memory. But the fire above was only half the sentence, because beneath the plain lay the very thing that had made the valley rich. For years, perhaps generations, the earth under those cities had stored up black wealth in hidden chambers, tar, petroleum, sulfurous deposits trapped in porous rock, compressed by the same deep fractures that had made the basin unstable from the beginning. The cities had built their prosperity over buried fuel and called it security. And when the thermal force from above met the volatile abundance below, the ground answered heaven. The bedrock broke. Flame erupted from beneath the cities, as if the valley itself had become a throat-vomiting fire. Burning pitch surged upward. Sulfur ignited. Vents split open. What had once seeped slowly from the earth in profitable measure now exploded out of it in judgment. The plain was caught between two mouths of destruction, fire descending, fire ascending, and in between them the cities were clamped like dry straw in iron tongs. This is why the old texts speak of brimstone, because anyone there would have known the smell instantly. Sulfur, burning oil, mineral vapor, superheated salt, a bitterness so sharp it would cut the inside of the lungs, a smell like the earth had been flayed open, a smell that did not merely offend the senses, but announced the end of a world. And then the sound, the detonation in the sky rolled over the basin like the striking of a cosmic drum. Below it came the roar of burning earth, the deep animal thunder of rupturing ground, the collapse of towers, gates, roofs, beams, courtyards, shrines, storehouses, streets, human civilization coming apart all at once. And beneath that, finer and more terrible, the thin, high cry of consumed air, the sound of oxygen itself being devoured by an inferno too hot to share space with life. Then, for one brief moment, silence. Not peace, vacuum. A devouring silence, the kind that comes when combustion has eaten so completely that even sound seems to hesitate. In places closest to the center, death was not always delivered by flame. It came by the theft of breath. Lungs failed. Blood lost its contract with oxygen. The cry forming in the throat never reached the mouth. Judgment silenced entire households mid-scream. Lot heard it from the road. He was already running, stumbling toward the smaller city he had begged for, dragging his fear through the gray light, with his wife and daughters beside him. Then, the valley broke behind them. He felt it before he understood it. A concussion through the soles of the feet. A shudder through the ribs. A roar that seemed too vast to belong to weather, war, or earth alone. The ground trembled under him. Heat struck his back like a furnace door thrown open. Terror gave strength to muscles that comfort had long ago softened. And beside him, his wife ran adorned with the life she was losing. Her bracelets rang softly as she moved. Her earrings caught the growing light. The ornaments she had worn to feasts, to banquets, to the rituals and social circles of the city now trembled against her skin, while the city itself was being erased. Every piece of jewelry carried a history. Every thread on her body belonged to a world she had helped assemble, curate, defend. Behind her lay her rooms, her table, her friends, her status, her habits, her remembered self. Behind her lay the only identity she still knew how to inhabit. That is why the command not to look back was never merely about eyesight. It was about allegiance. Because you can flee with your feet while your heart is still kneeling to the thing God is destroying. Something in her broke loose then, not physically, but inwardly. A pull stronger than fear. A pull stronger than survival. The magnetic force of attachment. She could hear the ruin. She could feel the heat. She knew the command, but the city behind her still owned a chamber in her soul. And she could not endure its disappearance without witnessing it one final time. So she stopped. Lot felt her hand leave his, but he did not turn. He could not. The daughters kept moving, driven by panic and command, but she remained in the road between what had been and what might still be. And she turned her face toward the burning plain. Do not call it mere curiosity. It was love. Corrupted love. Fatal love. Love for a world that had fed her vanity, structured her loyalties, and trained her to confuse belonging with bondage. She loved the life behind her more than the life ahead of her. She loved the city that was dying more than the mercy that was dragging her out of it. And in that single act, she revealed the deepest truth of judgment. Some people do not perish because the door was closed. They perish because, once it opens, they still prefer the cage. The air behind them was still laden with the chemistry of catastrophe, mineral-rich, salt-heavy, carrying the violent residue of the shattered basin. Heat and particulate and vapor swept the road. When she turned toward the blast, she turned into the full face of it. The body, full of moisture, met an atmosphere thick with the broken elements of the valley. Salt seized, crust formed, mineral overtook flesh. She was not transformed into a fairy tale relic. She was overtaken, encased, fixed in the material testimony of the place she would not release. And there she stood, a human outline held in salt and ruin, a monument to backward longing, a sermon in mineral form, a woman preserved not by honor, but by warning. Lot felt the loss, but kept running, because some griefs cannot be stopped for. Some obediences must continue bleeding forward. He and his daughters crossed into the smaller city, breathless, broken, alive, while behind them the great cities of the plain were being reduced to smoke, fused sand, poisoned earth, and the kind of silence that lasts for centuries. And hear me clearly, this is not only the story of what fire did to Sodom. It is the story of what attachment did to her. Judgment did not begin when the sky opened. It began long before, when the heart decided that what God was calling her out of was still worth one last look. Far above the plain, in the hills near Hebron, Abraham rose before the day had fully opened. Sleep had not held him. The night had been restless, burdened by the memory of that terrible exchange with God, the descending numbers, the narrowing hope, the final plea hanging in the dark like a last candle in a storm. 10. Surely there had to be 10. 10 souls with enough conscience left to hold back the blade. 10 hearts, not entirely swallowed by appetite. Surely, he walked back to the place where he had stood in intercession, where mercy had wrestled with judgment in the thin morning air. And from that height he turned his face toward the valley. What he saw stole the breath from his body. Not the glitter of cities, not walls flashing gold in the sunrise, not markets waking, not the ordered beauty of civilization. Smoke, a monstrous pillar of it, rising black and iron gray from the basin, streaked through with a dull internal red, like a wound still burning beneath the skin. It climbed into the sky in a column so immense, it looked less like smoke than like the earth itself crying out. The whole depression of the Dead Sea had become a bowl of fire residue, ash, vapor, and judgment, a place hollowed out by wrath, a place that no man should ever have to see with his own eyes. And Abraham stood there in silence. The sun rose higher. The smoke did not cease. The friend of God, the man who had bargained for mercy, understood at last that the arithmetic had not failed. The city had. There were not 10. There may not have been 5. There had barely been one soul dragged out alive, and even he came out broken, diminished, trailing loss behind him like a torn garment. The valley that once looked like blessing had been stripped to its true name. What seemed like Eden had become a scar. This was not ruin. It was erasure. When the fires had finished their work, they did not leave behind noble wreckage or shattered grandeur. They left powder, salt, sterility. The old centers of power were ground into the earth until even memory had to strain to find their outlines. The land itself changed character, as if creation had absorbed the verdict. Water shifted, soil soured, the basin became hostile to life. What had once lured men with abundance became a dead place, a mineral grave, and Lot, saved yet not restored, carried the city with him into the mountains he had feared. He escaped the streets, but not the contamination. He left the system, but the system had already entered his house, his children, his bloodline, his imagination. That is the last cruelty of corruption. If it is welcomed long enough, it survives the collapse of the world that taught it to you. So Abraham wept, not only for Lot, not only for the dead. He wept because he had witnessed a truth every generation tries to deny. Judgment does not fall because God is absent. It falls because he has seen too clearly, waited too long, and answered too late for the proud to escape. And the smoke rising over that ruined plain became more than the memory of a dead city. It became a warning to every age that prosperity can rot, that beauty can deceive, and that a civilization can look strongest on the very morning it is about to disappear. The Dead Sea still lies there like an open wound in the earth, more than 4,000 feet below the mountain ridges, sunk deep beneath the level of the living world. It gathers heat, salt, silence, and memory. Its waters are thick, heavy, unnatural to the touch, so saturated with minerals that the human body cannot sink into them the way it sinks anywhere else. You float there, whether you want to or not, held up by a chemistry born out of catastrophe. Nothing thrives in it. No schools of fish, no green growth beneath the surface, no hidden ecosystem quietly repairing the damage. It is a body of water that bears death in its name and keeps it, and the land around it remembers. Ash still speaks. Burned stone still speaks. Sulfur still speaks. Along those barren shores, the ground carries traces of impossible heat, evidence that the valley was not merely ruined, but answered. Even now, tradition points to formations of salt and says, there, a witness, a woman fixed forever in the posture of backward love. Legend and geology meet on that shoreline like two hands touching over a grave. But hear me carefully. This is not a relic story. This is not Bible scenery. This is not something safely buried in the ancient past where it can no longer accuse the present. This is a warning with your name on it. Because Sodom is not only a city. It is a pattern. It is the polished life that slowly demands your loyalty in exchange for comfort. It is the system that rewards your silence while hollowing out your soul. It is the career, the relationship, the social world, the private arrangement that makes you look successful from the outside while something essential inside you begins to die. It is luxury without innocence, influence without conscience, appetite dressed as sophistication. That is how people are lost. Not all at once, not in one dramatic act of rebellion. They lean toward it, then they settle near it, then they defend it, then they build inside it, and finally, they cannot imagine themselves apart from it. The cage becomes home. The compromise becomes personality. The warning feels offensive because it threatens not only your habits, but your identity. And when mercy comes, it rarely flatters. It calls you out. It tells you to leave, to move, to drop what you cannot carry into the next season, to stop negotiating with the thing God is trying to sever from your life. But most people do what Lot did. They hesitate, they stall, they ask for a smaller version of bondage, a cleaner sin, a more respectable compromise. Still, the warning stands. Judgment is not divine instability. It is divine incision. It is what happens when decay has been loved so long that removal becomes the final form of mercy, and the smoke that rose over that valley still rises in Scripture, still rises in history, still rises in the conscience of anyone willing to tell the truth. A people can have wealth, beauty, architecture, trade, status, ritual, confidence, and still be standing one breath away from collapse. So listen, the wind still moves over those salt flats. It moves through crystal, over ruined ground, across the memory of cities and the shape of a woman who could not let go. And the message has not changed. It has never changed. Do not love the burning thing more than the voice calling you out of it.